Cover crops do more than protect the soil. Learn their ways. I, the Sandman, have spoken. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Colby, and I'm with Practical Farmers of Iowa. Accompanying me behind the scenes and providing technical support is Phoebe Eichhorst. And thank you to the Sandman, the official Genuine Fox Farm spokescat, for those wise words to open our field day. We will shortly be broadcasting live in the field with Rob Faux of the Genuine Fox Farm in Tripoli, Iowa. A few weeks ago, Rob gave us an introduction to how and when he likes to use specific cover crops in his vegetable fields and how he terminates them and preps his beds for the next crop. Today, we're going to see a few more examples of how cover crops and pollinator plantings serve a few different roles on the farm. But first, like an old movie, we start with the credits at the top. We'd like to thank our major sponsors for their support of the virtual field day season. Their support helps make this virtual field day season possible, which features over 60 virtual field days. And guess what? You can attend all of them free of charge. Thank you, sponsors. Practical Farmers of Iowa is a farmer-led nonprofit based out of Ames. We specialize in farmer-to-farmer knowledge sharing and farmer-led research with a mission to equip farmers to build resilient farms and communities. All are welcome at PFI. We invite you to learn more about our organization and access our vast collection of resources at practicalfarmers.org. This virtual field day will run until 1:05 p.m. If you have questions for Rob during the field day, please type them into the comment box on Facebook, and I'll do my best to relay your questions to Rob during the discussion. And at the conclusion of the event, please give us your feedback via the online survey. We'll post that link in the comment box. Virtual events are new to us in 2020, and with your help, we're excited to learn and improve throughout the summer. Well, Phoebe, let's go live to Rob. And Rob, thank you for taking the time to host us today. And I know you have a lot to share, so I'm going to turn the reins over to you.
Thanks, Liz. I wanted to start by making note that I'm aware there are a lot of people out there who are still struggling to clean up after the derecho in Iowa. I wanted to remind people that Practical Farmers of Iowa is like an extended family for a lot of us, and if you are still in need of help, you should reach out to some of that extended family, and I'm sure there will be a number of people who will step up and give you the help you need. But otherwise, let's get right to the topic. Today's topic, I wanted to start with focusing on cover crops and plantings for poultry. And what I've done is I've got myself out here in the fields where we have our current broiler flocks. And if you look to your right, this area over here would be a perennial cover. And then to your left, behind me over here, this would be an annual cover. And what we're doing right now, I know it's hard to see, and we'll show it to you a little bit more closely in a bit, is I actually have two flocks of 125 broilers, and they're in two portable buildings that we try to move every other day. And what we've done is we've put them on both sides, partly for the field day, just to illustrate what happens with annual versus perennial, and also partly because this just happened to be the best part of the farm this year for us to put these birds. So it all worked out very nicely. For those who are curious, we actually don't use Cornish crosses. We use the Freedom Ranger type birds, in our case the Reds, and they are typically going to take 10 to 11 weeks to reach maturity. And when they reach maturity, we typically process them out between 4 and 6 pounds, which seems to be a pretty good size for most people who want to purchase them. What we have done is we typically will put them on pasture that is about 2 fences big, if you want to put it that way. We use Premier One electric netting with solar chargers to protect the birds during the night and during the day and keep them in their pasture. And both of these flocks are able to basically be in 2 sections, 2 standard sections of the poultry netting. They don't tend to want to go a whole lot further than that, but they do range a lot better than the white Cornish crossbirds do, and they do tend to forage more. So if you look carefully where I'm sitting right now, you'll notice that most of the vegetation is quite low. It's very close to the ground, and that's not just because we've been very dry the last 6 to 8 weeks. That's also because the birds do tend to eat plants. They do tend to go after the dew in the morning. They also go after all the insects that are in here. They're fairly decent foragers for chickens, but chickens are also known not to be terribly efficient either. But what has ended up happening is because it's been dry, we haven't had good conditions for our covers to return to any kind of useful situation. And just to give this a little bit more clarity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the camera, move it over here to this side where the perennial is, so you can see that a little better.
And Rob, while you're on the move, where do you have your birds processed?
Our birds are processed at Martzon Farm in Green, Iowa. And we have been using Green, Iowa's processing for the duration. And we've been doing broilers for, I would say, well, since 2006. So we've been doing that for a while. So we're in the perennial side right here. And you'll notice I'm sitting where the building was. And if you look towards the back, maybe I'll show you that just a little bit better. If you look back there a ways, you can see the buildings. And right now the birds are all inside because it's pretty darn hot and they really don't want to be outside, but they're very active during the morning and they're very active during the evening. And they do a lot of foraging. But most of their time that they spend during the night and then during the day is inside the building. So the area that I'm kneeling right now, everybody can feel free to say, ooh. The area I'm kneeling right now is where the building had been 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 10 days ago, 10 to 12 days ago. This is where the building was. If we had more normal rainfall, this area would already be greening up a good bit more. But if you look carefully, you can kind of see that I still have grass that's not completely matted down. The grass has not been pulled out. It's going to recover if we get a little bit of rain. And that's pretty typical of a perennial cover area for your birds. And we like to have largely a grass base. In this case, it's probably more of a perennial ryegrass. And then we'll have clover mixed in as well. And typically at this point, you're not going to see much for clover because the birds love the clover. And they do tend to beat it up pretty good, but it also tends to recover if you get a little bit of rain. So I'm going to move you over to the annual side now. I think it's pretty obvious we've got a difference here. This area right here is where the building was. It stayed in this position for 2 days, just like it did in the perennial. And you're not going to find a whole lot here that's going to come back. And this is partly because it's dry, but this is also what happens with an annual cover if you're going to put birds on it. If I wanted to do this and get the annual cover to maybe recover and come back a little bit, I'd be moving them every day. And even then, I'm not entirely sure a lot of annual covers are going to actually come back and give me another use. It may be more likely that you're going to end up reseeding and trying again if you want to reuse the same area. But more likely what I would do, and what I've done in the past, is if it's annual, I'll expect to just take them to a completely new area with new cover crop in it that's been established, and then allow this area to recover. I might reseed it with something else that I'm going to let winter kill, but that's usually what we end up doing if we have an annual cover. If I want it easy, I tend to go with perennial cover. At least easy because I don't have to do all the preparation of getting everything ready to go and then having more of my farm used for the next batch. We tend to do approximately 500 birds each year. And this year we're actually doing 2 batches of 250, 2 separate flocks because 125 seems to fit in each of our buildings without too much crowding. And part of the way we know they're not too crowded is they don't tend to pick on each other so much. So the birds that are less aggressive have places to go so they don't end up having problems. Are there any questions that you'd like me to cover about how we raise the broilers while we're still out here in the field?
Yeah, a couple of questions, Rob. So what was in this field before it was in this cover crop, either on the perennial or annual strips there?
The perennial strip in this case is actually an area that we've maintained as perennial throughout our history on the farm, because that is an area that would be considered part of our buffer zone for our certified organic status for vegetables.
Yes, I see the corn next to it now.
Yes, it's not too terribly far away. This area here last year was vegetables of various sorts. So the nice thing about this is if you're going to want to put fertility into your soil, then you could certainly use a mix of annual cover crop, get them well established, and then put birds on it. And once the birds have been on it, you'll see they pretty much destroy it. You don't have to do a lot of termination if you've got broilers on it. Now, where the building isn't, you're going to have to do a little termination of those cover crops because it's not as intense. But this sure is better than hand spreading or using a manure spreader or whatever you have to do if you've got birds in a building and you have to shovel it out.
And Rob,
yeah,
the buildings you have, are they just open floor? They're just a top, right? Top and sides?
that is correct. They're essentially a hoop with no bottom. They're on skids, so I can easily attach them to the bucket of the tractor and back up, pull them about one length away, and then start them all over again the next day.
And how large are those buildings behind you there?
The buildings are approximately 12 foot long and maybe 5 feet, maybe 6 feet wide. They're tall enough that I can stand at the peak with my head slightly bent. And that was part of one of my requests is I said, I don't want to have to go in there in a squat and try and do anything if I ever have to do anything with birds. So, so that was part of the design decision we made, because the higher profile you make one of these buildings, the more likely it is you get any kind of wind, it's going to lift up and move. So we were trying to balance that.
And sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I do like the arch too, as far as it's less likely to catch the wind unless it hits the end. So it tends to shed wind better.
Great. And what type of annual cover crop were you using where you are now? Was it a clover or a mix?
This was a mix. We threw in some annual ryegrass. We threw in some Berseem clover. And then, of course, there are some annual weeds that came up from where the vegetables were because we had some problems with some germination this year. Part of that had to do with how wet the spring was. But we still had good enough germination that we were fine with what we put out here. So those who are looking carefully at the video, you'll see a few things out here that certainly aren't annual ryegrass, certainly aren't Berseem clover. In fact, I'm having trouble finding any Berseem clover out here, and I suspect the birds went after that before they went after other things. So it would figure that probably the weedy things are the things that survived.
And what's the plan for this space since it is not likely to regrow with the amount of rain that you're still not expected to get? What's the next plan for this location?
The next plan for this location is I'm going to end up using the power harrow on this, and then I'm going to put a fall cover on it that I intend to winter kill. Now, it kind of depends on where I am with seed and where other parts of the farm, are getting things. But right now, I might consider putting in a real quick buckwheat and just let that bloom. And it'll probably get frosted on mid-September to late September, which would be about right. It might be a little quick, but we'll see. I'm kind of hoping that I could get a nice bloom out here for the pollinators at the tail end of the regular summer season. So that might be what I'll do, but failing that, if it gets a little too late, I've had good luck with Japanese millet as a follow-up. It's going to like the extra nutrients. It'll end up sucking some of that up, and then when it winter kills, it can slowly break down the rest of the system. So we'll see. If I get it done fast enough, it'll be buckwheat. If I don't get it done fast enough, it'll be Japanese millet.
Great. A couple more questions about the chickens. How do you keep from running over the birds when you move the building? And also, do you close them in at night in those buildings for predators, against predators?
Yes. Let's do the closing them up at night thing first. We do close them in the buildings at night for predators primarily. We do have problems with owls here, so if there is a bird that's left out overnight, an owl can easily take them. You might notice that our fences are slightly, it's elongated, it's not a perfect circle or square, And some of that's by design because some of the daytime swooping birds might have they'll have a little bit of a pause before they come in after something. It's not perfect, but it's something. We do get tired of closing them in at night because when it gets warmer, some of the birds do not want to go in. But we enforce that because the results are typically kind of gruesome the next morning. As far as moving the buildings are concerned, there's two ways we do this without running them over. One is that we will shoo them all out of the building and you put their food on the backward side. In other words, behind where the building is and not where you're going to end up pulling it. And they tend to go for the food and the water. And if you get them shooed out of the building, you can close the door, move the building, and you have no troubles. Sometimes some of them don't want to go out. And that's when we have two people on the job. One person's moving the tractor and the other person is just making sure the birds keep moving forward with the building as you move it. You would be surprised, it's really not all that hard to do, in particular because broilers love their food and they can be enticed to leave all kinds of places if you just put their food where they can see it. But yes, when we first started doing this, we were nervous about running over birds, and it became fairly easy even after the first time doing it. It's like, oh yeah, it's not that hard.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and move along.
Yeah, let's move on to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to move you to another location while we're doing PowerPoint.
All right.
So I think the first picture.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, the first picture you see is our hen pasture. So what you need to know is we actually have broilers, we have laying hens, and we also have turkeys on the farm. And at one point in time, we had ducks. We don't do those anymore. But what I wanted to show is the hen pasture, because the hen pasture is a location that we do not move. This is permanent fencing. It's next to a permanent building. And the permanent building is where the hens go at night for their protection. And then we let them out every day into the pasture. And what I wanted you to see in this particular picture is I want you to look carefully and notice there are two kinds of clover that are blooming in there. And this picture is from today. So there's red clover in there and there's New Zealand white clover. And I like having clover in hen pastures. They seem to love the clover. They'll go after it. It attracts different kinds of insects. And it also tends not to get too terribly tall. It's tall enough that the birds can get some cover. In fact, the red clover can easily get over the height of a hen's head. But it's not so tall that I can't tell what's going on in the pasture. Let's take a look at the next picture. So this is another section of that same hen pasture. And this is an area we keep mowed because it's closer to the building. And partly because it's closer to the building, it's beat up more because the hens tend to like to stay closer to their building. And it's on the north side of the building, so it doesn't get the sun. And also when we get too wet, this area tends to pond a little bit. We tend to get a little pond. So this is really hard for us to keep a good cover on this field. So right now, most of the green is plantain, which, as Dick Thompson would have said, it's a free cover crop in a way. I didn't plant it, it planted itself. It's there, it's green, it's covering the ground. The birds seem to like it most of the time. So that's what we have there because it's pretty hard to do much else with it. I wanted to point out though that we do keep edges in certain areas mowed in part as protection against predators. If I can't see the edges of the field, then I don't know until I've found a few dead birds or big piles of feathers that the raccoons are teaching their kits to hunt. And the common wisdom is raccoons tend to hunt when it starts to get dark or nighttime hours. But when they're teaching their kits to hunt, they will go in the middle of the day potentially. So we've lost hens in the middle of the day, especially when we haven't kept the edges clear so we can't see what's going on. Let's take a look at the next one. All right, so this is a picture of our summer cottage. The red building on the right is basically a trailer that we basically build a shed on. And this is where we put the older hens. When the newer hens come in, we put them in the permanent building. And then the older hens, they go into the summer cottage. And then we take them to various pastures wherever we feel we want them to go. And I took this picture because if you look to the left of the fence, you'll notice that there's some Dutch white clover blooming. If you look inside of the fence where the hens are, you're not going to see any clover blooming. I think that gives you a pretty good idea of the appetite that chickens have for clover. You go right to the edge of the fence and you won't find clover on the inside. I mean, you'll see the plants, but they will not look like what they do outside of the fence. And that kind of gives you an idea with what we do with the hens. So let's take a look at the next one, which takes us back to broiler chickens. So here's a picture of our first flock, one of our first flocks of broiler chickens. And I wanted to show this picture because this is actually a picture of some of the same perennial area I was just showing you. So this same perennial area in the spring already has hosted chickens once this year, and it recovered plenty for us to put chickens on it a second time. So it's just an illustration that if you move the birds every other day, pay attention to what's going on, overseed when you need to overseed, you can reuse a perennial strip. And I think the other thing I should probably mention is we try to move the building ever so slightly right or left from where we had them the time before, so we're not parking the building in exactly the same location during the next trip. But at least you've got a chance to reuse perennial pasture, especially if you take care of it.
Rob, I got a couple broiler questions that I want to throw in right now.
Yep.
Let's see. What's sort of the ideal height that you're looking for on the grazing? And are you raising meat birds in the winter as well as in the spring, summer, fall?
Okay, we do not raise any birds in the winter, so I'll get that one out of the way. It's not worth the energy to do, in our opinion. But as far as grazing height, if you want what I think is the ideal, then you're trying to get the cover about the height of the bird's head. It's not so much that it's overwhelming to the birds, and it's still enough that they love to get out there in the morning when you open up the door, and they like to run around in those grasses. I don't know what they're thinking when they do it, but they seem to enjoy it. It gets them out of the building, it gets them running around. And I know I said they tend to go where the food is, but this also alleviates some pressure, because if you've ever raised broilers, you know that if you put food out and the feeder's not necessarily square footage enough where every bird can get up next to the feeder, there's going to be a lot of quarreling going on. But when you've got some decent forage for them, you'll find a lot of the weaker birds, the ones that can't actually get next to the feeder, still have something to eat and something to do. And then eventually the day, everything levels out and every bird gets to the feeder. So I kind of like it just about the bird's head if I can manage it. If it's taller, it's not the end of the world. But I think you'll find that things start matting down and they don't necessarily get what you're hoping out of it if you start getting it a lot taller than that. Sometimes we have a taller patch that we'll put inside the fence, and on hot days they'll go into that and they'll use that as a cool down location. So I'm not saying you can't have something taller. In fact, it would be nice if you could, but sometimes that gets in the way of your fences and in the way of moving your building. So if I had a perfect world, I'd say chicken head height and go from there. Let's take a look at the next slide. So this is an example of what happens when you get too much rain on our farm. I just wanted to point that out, is we did have some trouble with way too much rain early this year. And in fact, for the last few years, we've had too much rain on our farm, which seems really odd because I'm out here in really dry dirt. And we haven't had much rain to speak of for some time now. But we had an awful lot of rain. And if this happens to you, and you don't have a bottom on your building, the problem now is it's not real easy. You can't really move the building with the birds in. So we ended up grabbing a bunch of pallets and a couple of straw bales. And we went out there and we put pallets down on the ground and put straw on top of it, picked all the birds up out of the water and put them on the straw. Sometimes you just do what you have to do. The good news is we only lost 9 birds out of 125 for this building. So we moved fast enough and we got it taken care of. And then when the water went down a little bit, we were able to move the building and get it out of that area.
Rob, a couple more hen questions if I can throw these in.
Yep.
What's the approximate size of that pasture you have for your hens by the building? And do you slaughter your hens every year or do you keep them over the winter?
Okay, the hen pasture is approximately 120 foot wide by about 400 feet to 500 feet long. So it's a good sized pasture. We've made sure to put in some Nanking cherry bushes and a couple trees in there for cover. But we do intend it to be a permanent pasture. We don't intend on knocking it down and reseeding it. Maybe we'll frost seed it sometimes, or we'll do a small section where we'll reseed. As far as hens are concerned, we do keep them through the winter. We start our hen chicks, say April one year, and they will go through one winter, and then October, November the following year, then we will process them as stewing hens. Or if there are people who are interested in older hens that still maybe lay a little bit, we might sell them to folks who want them. But generally speaking, we get about a year and a half out of them. And then we get all new.
Fantastic. Well, I'll let you move along to the next photo.
Yes. What is the next photo? Oh, yes, turkeys. So we have turkeys as well. And I've got 2 pictures here. This is a turkey. This is a picture of turkeys in their pasture fairly early in the season for them to be out on the pasture. And again, ideally, I'd love for the cover to be just about where their heads are, but rarely do I actually time that perfectly for some reason. Nonetheless, that would be pretty ideal. Turkeys can have some taller areas that they like to go wander in, but that's more true as they get older. So let's show the next picture. This is where the birds are very close to approaching Thanksgiving. You'll notice the field around them is pretty well cropped. They do a real good job of either trampling things or nibbling on things, so there's not a whole lot left. And the other part of it is it's October in this picture, so there's not a whole lot of regrowth going on. So this is where it's kind of nice to have some adjacent pasture area that has some taller stuff in it that you can kind of take a portable fence and let them out into it. I will say the only problem with turkeys and giving them temporary pastures is that they have been known to decide to simply walk over an electric fence that is on. And there are enough of them, they'll just kind of blow right through it. Most of the time they all get through, but there's usually at least one bird that gets tangled up in it, and you find it when it's too late. So that's the one problem we have with that. If it was a perfect world and I had all the time and money in the world, I would probably set up a couple of paddocks for our turkeys with permanent fencing and gates, and then I could move them where I wanted them to go during the day. You would be surprised how ready they are to be led somewhere. For those who are wondering, how do you get turkeys to go somewhere in particular? It's not too terribly hard to do. You would just have to have a main yard that you're going to sacrifice as getting beat up. And then I think you could certainly get them to go elsewhere. So that's what we would do with the turkeys. Let's take a look at the next slide. What do we got on the next one? I think it's some red clover. Yeah, here's a picture of a bunch of red clover we have established in an area with some oak trees in the background. This red clover is probably about knee height in this picture, and it's starting to bloom. And it's just an example of trying to get red clover going with some ryegrass in it, but pretty much it's all red clover at this stage. The next picture should show you some of the red clover flowers. We love these. Bumblebees like red clover. We've kind of noticed that the honeybees don't particularly care for red clover so much, which is part of the reason we like having the Dutch white clover in our perennial plantings as well. But I love the bumblebees, so we like to encourage red clover whenever we can. And on the next slide, you can see we encourage red clover because it gives us luck. Those who are interested can look at this picture carefully, and I think you might find at least 3 4-leaf clovers in it. I do have Irish background, so it must be that. That's the reason we have some four leaves. Let's take a look at the next slide, see what we've got. Okay, this is a pollinator planting with perennials or easily reseeded tender perennials. So you're going to see rudbeckias in there. There's some milkweed, coneflowers, any number of things. And this is an area that we keep perpetually in pollinator type plants that are typically perennial. Just wanted to show that we have sections where we try and maintain continual plantings of this sort. The next picture should show something a little different. We've got sunflowers up high, you've got coneflowers in the midground, and then you've got oregano in front of that. So we do use our herbs sometimes as a perennial cover crop in an area that's a pollinator support. And we found, at least at our farm, oregano likes to make a nice big mat, and it attracts the pollinators, and it's pretty healthy, and it looks good, so we like that. The one thing I wanted to point out is to the right of the sunflowers, there's a lot of Queen Anne's lace in there. And I'm not particularly fond of Queen Anne's lace, but then again, it's not causing me great amounts of trouble either, so I don't end up knocking it down, especially when it's in a difficult place to get. Let's take a look at the next one. Okay, this is one of our current vegetable, this is one of our smaller plantings of vegetables this year. And we ran an annual planting of flowers for pollinators, among other things, down the center. And this is, I think, 4 or 5 different kinds of flowers in this particular planting, but you'll notice I'm running them in sections. I'm not mixing them up a whole lot, which I realize if I wanted a lot of diversity, it'd be nice if I could really mix it up. But there's a reason that I'm doing what I'm doing. So let's go ahead and go to the next picture and look at it. This is one of my favorites. This is Borage, and it's got those nice blue flowers, and it starts blooming in July, and it'll keep blooming all the way into September. The difficult thing some years about Borage is if you get a nice wind, it flattens it down, but then it's still going to send out more flowers and keep attracting the pollinators. Our honeybees love it, the bumblebees love it, all the native bees tend to like it. So it's one of our favorites for attracting pollinators, and we like to run strips of borage, especially next to vine crops, because we think it attracts a lot of the pollinators we need for our vine crops. And then the next one is a multi-species trial. This is annual flowers and annual plants. And Liz, I think we did this trial in 2017.
Sounds correct.
Okay, and this picture shows mostly at this stage buckwheat blooming. There are other things down in the understory, but this is mostly buckwheat at the early stage. And unfortunately, what we found is the buckwheat did extremely well, and everything else didn't do quite so well. But let's look at the next picture and see what we can see here. Okay, so there's some buckwheat in there, and if you look really closely at the bottom right, you'll see a cosmos that has started growing in the middle of the buckwheat, and you'll see a couple of other leaves in there, things that are not buckwheat. And then let's go to the next one. Okay, this one is after the buckwheat has finished its bloom, and you'll see the most common thing are cosmos in there, and then you might see a couple of other flowers or other plants. Unfortunately, one of the things that happened with this planting is there were certain hardy weeds that got into this as well, and we, because it was an annual planting and we wanted to allow all the slower germinating things to go somewhere, that meant the things that didn't get smothered by the buckwheat, the weeds ended up coming up, and the buckwheat wasn't seeded thick enough to smother it, because that would have prevented all the other things from growing. So this ended up not being the best situation for us, because this was an area we would like to grow vegetables in say a future year, or at least not create a weed problem. So that's kind of why we've decided to start going in patches. We get our diversity, but we don't get it necessarily mixed, because that makes it easier for us to control what's growing and where it's growing, and then we can keep things like Canadian thistle out, or if we've got crabgrass or other things growing that might sneak into this mix, we're able to control it a little bit. I think that takes us out of our PowerPoint slide.
All right. And hey, Rob, I'm going to just throw a few questions at you. And I also, we've reached 105, but we're going to keep going because I know that you've got a few more things you want to show us. And if people need to get off, they can check the recording later, but let's keep going for now. So one question, with the poultry grazing, are there any crops that you've seen particular benefit and any crops that you think have been harmed by having poultry graze prior to them?
All right, well, I'll clarify something on poultry grazing here. When we do poultry grazing, the next time we tend to plant a cash crop would be the following season. I do not start a cover crop or a chicken, a crop after chickens have grazed during the same year, largely for food safety reasons, of course. What I have noticed, however, is that things like lettuces and melons, things that are heavier feeders, tend to respond well to a field that has had poultry on them the year prior. We have not noticed a whole lot of difference. Say, for example, green beans, I don't notice much change there. What does change, though, is if you have particular problems with keeping something clean of weeds, depending on what your cover was that you have the birds on, you might have a little bit more problem with weeds the following year, because sometimes you'll import some with your feed. Sometimes there will be some things that sneak into what you have and you don't get them knocked down. So I would say probably most crops are fine. You just might want to pay attention, especially early on, if you've got a new type of weed getting going where you're growing.
Do you use your do you use your birds to do any field cleaning after you've harvested, or do you just keep them out of the production beds?
We have used birds to clean up fields in the past. You have to move them more often because, of course, if you've kept things pretty clean and you don't have a lot of weeds all over the place, then they're going to be on a dirt surface, and they tend to actually consume some of that dirt and get it in their gullets. It's not the best place for them, for their health. But sure, sometimes we put them in the tomatoes. We've taken the cages off the tomatoes and knocked them down and let them run around. And I have found that the hens do better with cleanup than the broilers do. In part because broilers just don't seem to be quite so selective with what they're doing, and they are very ground-based, whereas the hens, they're more willing to hop up into the building on their perches and just move around a lot. So we've used them to clean up. You just have to be ready to move them a lot. And then, of course, the next season, you have to be aware of where you had the birds and what you're growing. So I wouldn't, for example, seed early spinach or early lettuce in there just for the food safety purposes, because I would be using them for cleanup late in the year prior. So I'd use a lot of caution, but I can do it.
And are your birds organic, or are they just on your farm and not certified?
Excellent question. We do not certify our birds as organic. Therefore, we can get away with a couple of things. You know, for example, we have them out on the buffer strip. The broilers are on the buffer strip, and I might not be able to do that if I wanted to be certified organic because it's now next to the cornfield. But otherwise, the main reason we don't do certified organic is we don't have an easy place. We don't have a place that's certified organic for processing. So that's the main reason we don't do it. Otherwise, we're very close to, we could probably be certified if we wanted to work with a large.
All right, well, let's, oh, a question about feed. Do you think the chickens eat less feed when they're grazing?
Yes, the chickens eat less feed when they're grazing. That's a definite.
All right,
they do
great.
eat more as it gets dry because there's less for them to forage.
Well, let's get back to buckwheat because I think that's what we're going to talk about next. And there's a question about your cutoff date for planting buckwheat. So I'll let you get to it.
All right, as far as buckwheat is concerned, um, if you can get buckwheat put in when there's a rain coming, or if you can do some overhead irrigation, buckwheat's going to start germinating in just a couple of days. And it'll germinate quick, it'll grow quick. So I typically think if I've got about 30 days, I have enough time for buckwheat. Now in our area, we've gotten a frost as early as the 10th of September while I've been doing this. And so I've watched the buckwheat crop crisp up before it got to where I wanted it to go. And then we've had our late frost as late as October 20. So I'm kind of right now on the edge of where I would want to put buckwheat, which is why I said if I get to it in the next 2 days, I'll probably do buckwheat. If I don't get to it, then I'm going to go to Japanese millet because it can handle some of the temperatures buckwheat cannot. Buckwheat, if it gets down to 34, it typically singes. If it gets down to 32, it's gone. And if it singes, it's not going to flower or grow much beyond that, so it's as good as done. So that's typically the way I'm looking at buckwheat. I like to put it in the middle of the season as a quick turnaround crop. So if I have something early like spinach, I could put buckwheat in there, and then I could throw in something late that's a fairly short season after that, maybe a late beet crop, for example. But that's typically what I do with the buckwheat is I run it to flower. I let it flower for a little while, let the bees have at it, and then we mow it down, and then we're ready to go with the new crop if we want to.
Sounds good. All right. Well, no more questions for now. So what else you got to show us there?
Well, I got 2 more things here I wanted to show everybody. So over on my right, your left over here, this is our nice 400-foot row of zinnias. We love our zinnias. They're not necessarily a cover crop, but what I wanted to show with these is that there is actually squash on the other side of this. And you'll notice there's a few vines that are starting to get through my wall of zinnias. But one of the things I like to do with zinnias, I like to plant them closer than probably most people want to. And it creates a wall and it kind of contains your vine crops. So if you've got something on the other side of the zinnias, you don't necessarily have these invaders coming through and suddenly you've got a Wolfen butternut in the middle of whatever your other crop is out. So we do like our zinnias. They do attract the butterflies. They attract the larger bumblebees. Plus, I like them. And if the farmer likes them, I'd like to encourage people to remember that if you're the farmer and you're on this farm and you're living there and there's something you like a certain kind of flower, then treat yourself to it because you need to like what you're doing. And this is part of what helps me like what I'm doing. So that's the zinnias. And then I have one more thing to show everybody. See if we can show that. Liz, how's that look? Can you see the tool on the tractor there?
I can see your Tine Harrow, yes.
Yes. So this is a flex Tine Harrow. And I'm going to come over here closer to it. So if you're going to do cover crops, if you don't own a flex Tine Harrow, but if you can borrow one, and this is what they do, they're very flexible. If you broadcast your cover crop and you want to get a little bit more soil to seed contact, I find that a flex Tine Harrow, if you take all the knives and just have these on the most aggressive setting, it does a really great job of incorporating a broadcast seed. It doesn't put them in too deep for the most part, and it just gets them slightly covered. You're going to lose less of it to predation, and you'll have a little bit better germination. So I remember last time we showed you a couple of other tools, so I thought I'd at least show one more tool that I particularly like when it comes to cover crops.
I got 2 more quick hitter questions for you, Rob.
Yep.
The breed of your hens, what do you like?
Okay, well, we do tend to have Isa Browns, which I know is not very creative. Those are our brown egg layers. We have California Whites, and we also have Americanas. So we try to have a mix. We have done others, including the Buff Orpingtons, and I'm trying to think of some of the others. But when it comes to, if you're worried about consistent egg laying, we've found a number of those tend to slow down an awful lot in the winter, even though they're known to be winter hardy. If you actually have a building where you can get a little bit of heat into the building, I bet you the Australorps and the Orpingtons and some of those would probably do fine. But we do not have heat in the building, so we're going with the breeds that seem to work out, the California Whites, the Isa Browns, and then the Americanas. They tend to shut up in the winter. They don't tend to lay through the winter, but we like the greens and blues to mix into our egg cartons that we sell, so we're willing to give them a pass and let them be part of the flock.
And also, can you give us the name of that chicken processor again? I'm going to put the name in the chat box for people to look up their contact info.
The processor is Martzons, Martzahn, and they are in Green, Iowa. They do a fine job. Their birds are always very clean. We've never had a complaint with how they process, and they're just good people.
Great. Well, Rob, is there anything else you want to close with before I take us out?
No, I just think you should all try and do what you can with cover crops, though. I never get done all the cover crops I want to do. In some years, I've even been shut out a couple years, and I was very disappointed by that. But if you're a vegetable grower especially, I think you've got all kinds of opportunities. And you should see if you can find those little niches to put them in there. It helps with your soil. It helps cover things up so it doesn't blow away or so it doesn't run away. You can use it for forage. It's a worthwhile tool, so don't ignore it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rob. Appreciate you being here and getting all this set up for us. And everyone on Facebook, thank you so much for attending. I know we went a little long, but I think it was well worth your while, so appreciate you sticking around. If you want to rewatch or share this with your friends, all of the recordings of these field days are available on our website, on our Facebook page, and our YouTube channel. And I'm just going to pop into the comment box the link to the last field day that Rob held earlier this summer that has some more information about how he uses cover crops on his farm, so you can check that out. Let's see, I think Phoebe put in, and there's so many comments now, you're gonna have to spend another 10 minutes on here reading the comments. Phoebe put on a reminder to, if you wanna sign up for day of reminders for each of our virtual field days, you can use that constant contact link that Phoebe put in the chat box. We won't use that email address for anything else, but wanna keep you informed on the field days, and I know it's easy to forget with all of the Zoom meetings we all have lately. We'd also appreciate you taking the evaluation we have there. For participating, you'll be entered to win a PFI water bottle that we'll mail over to you, and more importantly, we'll get your feedback. And we've got more videos to come, more field days to come, and until then, stay healthy, help your neighbors, especially if you live in Iowa right now, and enjoy the sunshine out there. Thanks, folks.